Welcome back to our interview series, Israel's MultiFront Threats, where we examine each of the security challenges facing Israel as it fights to protect its citizens. Today we're focusing on Yemen and the threat from the Houthis, an Iranian-backed terrorist group that is attacking Israelis and Americans. For many years, Iran has provided weapons and training to the Houthis, including sophisticated attack drones and ballistic missiles. Since October 7th, the Houthis have attacked and hijacked commercial ships in the Red Sea, causing major disruptions to global trade. They've also attacked American personnel, and they've launched missiles into Israel. Joining us today to discuss the threat from Yemen is Kirsten Fontenrose, president of Red 6 Solutions and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Kirsten, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Corey.
So I think if we go back previously before October 7th, a lot of folks maybe wouldn't have heard of the Houthis and didn't know the connection with Iran. So let's start with some background. Who are the Houthis and why are they such a threat to Americans and Israelis?
The Houthis are an ideological movement, and they were founded by Hussein al-Houthi, who combined both a religious belief and a political belief. So religiously, they're founded on Zaydism, which began in 1893, and it has a belief in its construct that says that only a certain relative of the Prophet Muhammad is divinely ordained to rule all of the Arabian Peninsula. So in this way, they actually don't overlap very much with Iran, who we'll talk about shortly, I'm sure, because Iran has an idea in Velayat al-Faqih, their ruling construct, that says that imams are infallible. The Houthis do not believe this. They're much more like Sunnis in that you speak directly to God. Politically, however, they began adopting the foreign policy ideas of Ayatollah Khomeini in the 1990s. So they took on the Iranian beliefs in that sense and have kind of moved forward with it ever since then. In 2014, they took over Sana'a after one of their many conflicts with the legitimate government of Yemen, but they were not so good at that governance thing. They have not paid salaries since 2016. When they came into power, they shuttered media, they kicked women out of the workforce, they banned political parties. So they have not been particularly popular, and they really only represent about 20% of the entire Yemeni population, which is very factionalized. In March of 2021, the last Jewish family left Yemen after about 3,500 years of Jewish heritage in Yemen. And this was a buildup from 2005 or so, where they really began harassing Jewish citizens of Yemen, throwing them in jail, telling them either leave or you'll continue to do this jail time.
It's a very important context in history, and that brings us to today, where we've seen the Houthis have really adopted sophisticated weaponry. Talk to us about that connection to Iran in funding the Houthis, and what are their military capabilities today?
Sure. The Iranians continue to train, to provide weapons, to provide components of weapons, proprietary components of weapons. In the beginning of the relationship, Iran had to provide them the entire kit. Now, the Houthis have the capability to produce with 3D printing or in their own factories a lot of the airframes, for instance, for their drones or parts of their missiles. And Iran really only has to smuggle in tiny wiring pieces, which makes interdiction that much harder. But the Iranian connection goes back quite some time. In 2015, they started providing missiles, we believe short and medium turn. In 2017, they started providing drones. But even in Yemen's civil war, which ended with the national dialogue that broke down in 2014, we saw Iran and Hezbollah providing support to the Houthis against the Yemeni official government, which was backed by Saudi Arabia. So there's both a political and a warfare kind of connection, even more so than really an ideological connection, other than this belief by Iran that this is a convenient way to harass their neighbor Saudi Arabia on their southern border. Of the 6 types of missiles that have been launched, and I think this is important looking at their capabilities, all 6 of them are based on Iranian models. There are others in development, there are others on the shelf, but every one that we've seen launched, including since October 7th and including at Israel, have been based on Iranian models. One of them, the Shahed 136, is called the Wa'ed 2 for the Houthis, and this has the capability to reach Israel. They have 2 missiles that can reach Israel, and 1 drone that can reach all of Israel, and 1 that can reach about half of Israel. This is a new capability. So for instance, in 2019, their max reach with a missile was about 1,200 kilometers. Now that is 1,900 kilometers. So what's that difference? The difference is all of the state of Israel.
And we've seen since October 7th, Iran has been instructing the Houthis in its attacks on Americans and on Israelis. And we've seen all the disruption to the global trade, the Houthis attacking commercial ships in the Red Sea. What has that strategy looked like? Why has it been so effective? And how are the Houthis leveraging that ability to attack those commercial vessels to achieve its goals?
Great question, and there are multi-part answer to it. We think they've attacked roughly 70 ships in the last several months. They've sunk 1 ship. They've killed crew members on another ship, on several other ships. In March, Central Command, U.S. Central Command tells us that they interdicted 60 missiles alone, or 60 drones alone, in just that 1 month. And 28 of those were on 1 day. They came in 2 waves. So this is the Houthis experimenting not with true AI-enabled swarms, but with swarms, where they send in drones or missiles that are smaller, distract the air defense systems, and then send in larger firepower behind it, while the limited systems that are either on our ships or are land-based are addressing the first threats. They're really learning as this conflict goes on. This conflict has also given them their 15 minutes of fame. They are a household name from Pakistan to Morocco. They're hailed as the one armed group that is supporting Hamas. And it's made them a little famous, and frankly, they're a little punch drunk on this. Then domestically, this has truly increased their base of domestic support. As I mentioned, only about 20% of the population is aligned with them politically or religiously, but the Yemenis are united in their opposition to what they perceive is Israel's relationship with Palestinians. And so this has given them a way to rally the population, kind of unify the population behind them. And it's been very useful, because prior to the conflict in Gaza, there were street protests in Sana'a. We had people in Yemen protesting against the salaries not being paid, for instance, or basic services not being provided. This has been a great way to make people forget about that. So now, if you raise your voice about your salary as a civil servant not being paid, you are labeled as an Israeli sympathizer. So very convenient, very useful as a domestic crutch for rallying the population. In terms of partnerships, we've also seen that they've become so emboldened, they've started to reach out quite a bit. They've signed new memorandums of understanding with both pirates off the coast of Somalia to simply hijack ships and take the booty. I mean, there's no ideological piece to this. And they've also signed a very worrying MOU earlier this year with Al-Shabaab, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in East Africa, which currently holds more territory globally than any other Al-Qaeda affiliate. And we believe the intent here is to target American troops, perhaps in Kenya. So this sort of emboldening we hadn't seen from them before. Right now, there are also economic impacts for this conflict. 10% of global trade goes through the Bab el-Mandeb. 50% of the trade that goes through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea has declined since this conflict began. If you're Egypt, imagine what that has done to your already fragile economy. We're also seeing that routing around the Cape of Good Hope for most of the major shipping corporations is really skyrocketing prices in terms of fuel and wages and insurance. Really, if you want to ask about the impact of this attack, insurance underwriters are defining the impact of all of these Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping. And then there's an environmental impact. For instance, on February 18th, we saw an attack on a fertilizer vessel that caused an 18-mile-long toxic oil slick in the water. So they've both really benefited from it politically and in terms of their ability to reach and bring partners in. They've even started issuing their own currency, which is a crisis for Yemen's central bank. But then we also see the impacts it's having negatively on the global economy, on the environment, and certainly on stability in the Middle East.
So Israel is fighting now a 6-month war in Gaza. The Houthis represent a threat from the south, and Israel's facing threats from multiple fronts at once. So talk to us a little bit about how the Houthis compare to those other threats, to Hamas, Hezbollah, Iranian-backed proxies in Syria and Iraq, and how does it have to account for that threat as it defends its citizens?
All of these proxies share an intent So there's a shared slogan, death to America, death to Israel, curse the Jews. So the intent is very clear. Then it's just about how does Iran equip them to carry out this intent. And that's where it differs. And you've almost seen the difference in how they've been armed based on who Iran perceives the primary adversary for that group would be. So for the Houthis, they're looking at Saudi Arabia, and now they're looking at Israel because they can, because they've reached that level of technological capability. For Hamas, they were looking predominantly at Israel. For Hezbollah, they actually consider Hezbollah a global reach group. So it's not only Israel, it's not only Syria. Hezbollah is sort of their sourdough seed. They train people around the world. We know they're in Latin America. They came to Yemen and trained the Houthis. We've seen them so many places. And that's why Hezbollah is kind of their golden child. They've equipped Hezbollah to the extent that we are concerned that a full onslaught for Hezbollah would be extremely difficult for Israel to fend off. I don't want to say impossible, but it's close, without a lot of outside support. Iran's real intent is to extend the border, their own border, out to the borders of their adversaries. So they don't want to reconstruct or run any of the countries where they have armed proxies. Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, any of the countries, they're not interested. And this actually was an insight I gained from a foreign minister in an Arab country that has a great relationship with Iran. And he pointed out to me that their intent really is just to move the pain point to the borders of their adversaries. So the Houthis on the southern border of Saudi Arabia, keep them distracted, keep them engaged, keep their global status lowered because they're in a conflict. And the same with Hamas and Hezbollah. They are tools to keep Israel distracted, engaged, keep NATO and the US distracted and engaged, so they can carry out their own domestic oppression at home, make sure that they can continue on the regime, conduct strikes in Pakistan without anyone talking about it, these sorts of things. So
on the nuclear front as well.
Exactly. Oh, the nuclear program, of course. So the intent is very similar of these groups, and the intent of their sort of lord and master is very similar. The reach and capability is different, and it is in accordance with the enemy that Iran envisions for them and the enemy they envision for themselves. So they'll have close-range weapons to fight the local governments with, and they'll have longer-range weapons or medium-range weapons, depending on how far that adversary is from them. So really, only the Houthis need long-range at this point. Hezbollah likes long-range because it is the grandmaster of all of the proxies. And Hezbollah needs to be perceived as a group with international reach because that asymmetric threat is an important arrow in Iran's quiver. But there are differences in things like Hezbollah and Hamas actually are part of elected governments, right? The Houthis are not. And in terms of how the world is watching. So the Hezbollah threat has been a problem for countries where they have covertly carried out activities, for instance. Hamas is perceived as a threat to Israel and no one else. No intelligence agency has assessed that they pose an existential threat to any other country in the world, i.e., we can pretend this is Israel's problem alone. We can pretend this is not part of a larger picture. But we know, for instance, now that the Houthis have started attacking ships in the Red Sea, global shipping, impacting trade, China is watching very closely, not only for their own economic interests, but from the perspective of U.S. partnership with Israel. They're watching to see the U.S. willingness and capability to respond to threats to naval shipping lanes. And what does this mean for them in the South China Sea? So this smaller picture is part of a bigger threat picture, which is part of a much larger international security picture.
So clearly an important strategy on the Iranian part to leverage the Houthis to really cause chaos globally with repercussions that do span the globe. I want to ask you about the American response now. We saw, starting in January, the U.S. response to target Houthi locations in Yemen. What's been the impact of those American responses militarily, and do you expect to see more of those moving forward?
The strikes the Americans conduct in cooperation with the Brits and with 12 other countries that are part of Operation Prosperity Guardian were never intended to destroy the Houthis. The U.S. has actually showed quite a bit of restraint in this. You notice that the targets have very few, if any, impacts on civilian lives, and they are really focused on imminent threats by international law definitions, so threats that are about to pose an attack on a U.S. or U.K. or other coalition or partner country asset or interest. And these strikes are really intended to degrade the Houthis' capability to continue to impact the global economy with endurance, with longevity, and with distance, and with volume. So if we can take off of the battlefield any percentage of their arsenal, this is a win. It means they can conduct fewer attacks for less time and perhaps with less reach. As I mentioned, some of these new weapons that can extend to all of Israel and to the Arabian Sea, to the Indian Ocean. Their targeting is terrible, though. That's really what's saving things right now. But they know this, and they're improving it. And this is another place where Iran is really pitching in with intelligence that's helping the Houthis to target. So General McKenzie, the former commander of Centcom, said recently that the Houthi arsenal, he believes, is finite. So as I mentioned, every little increment that we can withdraw from it is a positive. The Houthis do believe that the US and the UK have a limited appetite for response, and that we are not willing to risk being blamed for civilian casualties or for starting a war in a US election year, this sort of thing. So they're really toying with us. They think they can get away with quite a bit right now. Now, looking at the US election cycle, would that change? What's their calculus? We can't know. But the strikes right now really have not been intended to do away with the Houthis, simply to reduce their ability to cause harm to the global economy. U.S. policy, in addition to these military strikes, has focused on two things. One is this Operation Prosperity Guardian I mentioned, which is defensive and is the U.S., the U.K., and 12 other countries began the strikes in January, but also on designation. So the Trump administration designated the Houthis both as a specially designated terrorist group, which is a slightly lesser designation, and as a foreign terrorist organization. The Biden administration took both off at the beginning of their time in the seat and recently put the first back on. So the Biden administration sees these both as levers. They can either reward the Houthis by removing that first lesser designation or punish the Houthis by reapplying the foreign terrorist organization designation, depending on how the Houthis respond to both our pressures on global shipping and to our pressures on a political settlement in their war with Saudi Arabia. So that's where U.S. policy has focused. It's really on trying to solve for both problems, both bringing an end to the conflict that has caused a much larger humanitarian crisis since 2014, and in which we assess that the Saudis have been very compliant in recent times, and the Houthis have been quite intransigent, and in bringing an end to the global shipping problem. The U.S. doesn't really get much of its oil through that lane, but U.S. partners do, and we've promised in our national security strategies, national defense strategies, that we will be guardians of freedom of navigation, and we're standing up to that. So that's where U.S. policy has focused.
You've mentioned General McKenzie and Centcom a couple of times. I want to ask you about that. Israel's integration into the U.S. Central Command has really been hugely important for Israel and for U.S.-Israel cooperation in the region. Maybe you could spend a minute on that. What has the integration of Israel into Centcom enabled from a cooperative standpoint between the two countries?
Quite a bit. One case, just to be very frank, you won't see it in writing, but for many countries in the Arab world where having overt relationships with Israel is difficult for their political leadership, even if there are quiet communications behind the scenes, and there are in almost every single case between political leaders and intelligence leaders, the integration into Centcom has allowed their militaries to publicly take part in many important exercises for interoperability, for responses to counterterrorism, for emergency search and rescue, a gamut of both offensive and defensive capabilities that we think it's really important to have the region working together on. You probably noticed last year the U.S. Through a multi-domain exercise with Israel, and it was sort of this, come to our side, we have cookies sort of expo. Look at what is possible when you integrate with two strong partners, the U.S. and the Israeli military, to increase the capabilities of your own militaries. So it's really been a boon, not just for Israeli integration and for the U.S. vision of a unified region that's interoperable with the U.S., but also in terms of the Arab armies who really would like to be more integrated and share both intelligence, technologies, capabilities, know-how, lessons learned with the Israeli forces. It's allowed them to do that. October 7th notwithstanding, it's allowed that kind of partnership on the battlefield because the U.S. has asked asked that it be included, and we, as a member of Centcom, either choose to belong to Centcom or not belong to Centcom. We choose to belong, therefore we work with Israel. Enough said. And so far that has been palatable for populations in these countries.
Earlier in our conversation, you touched on drones and AI and some of the sophisticated weaponry that the Houthis have. I want to ask you about Israel's capabilities, both from a defensive standpoint in combating the threats from Houthis in Yemen, and also offensively. Does Israel have what it needs to defend itself against this particular threat?
Israel has the capability, but maybe not the depth. So as you're very aware, you have Iron Dome, which is for short term, David Sling, which is for medium range, and then you have the Arrow air defense system, which is for longer range threats. The Houthis forced the first use of the Arrow defense system by firing a cruise missile at Israel. Luckily, it worked. I say luckily, but you know what I mean? You don't know until it's put to use. And so Israel has the layered in-depth defense, but each shot that the Arrow shoots, for instance, is about a $2.2 million missile. So it's quite expensive, and you have timelines for production, and you have limited arsenals. So Israel has to make sure it has both the financial support and the production capability, which means you probably don't need to have a conflict going on to be able to maintain these kinds of defensive systems. Yemen really has opened a new front because it was not forced to address the long-term threat until the Houthis started firing. It also means an entire additional set of borders and scan of the sky has to be covered. This is expensive, this is time-consuming, this is a manpower issue for already overextended reservists. So Israel really does need support to make sure that it can cover down on all of this. And frankly, the conversation shouldn't only be about Israel. The Houthis now have the capability to reach multiple choke points in global shipping. So this problem about the Houthi expansion of their reach with these drones, with these missiles, is about everybody's problem if you use any naval shipping routes.
It's a great segue into my final question for you, which is about the role of the United States. The president has asked for $14.3 billion in vital security assistance for Israel. Talk to us about why that's so important and the importance of passing that aid both for Israel and the United States to defend against threats like we see in Yemen.
In a nutshell, U.S. aid in the military sector to other countries is at its root intended to make it less necessary that the U.S. has to send troops and its own equipment abroad to defend our partners and allies. So argument for aid for any partner and ally that is in conflict just makes basic sense. And the timeline on this, because as we mentioned, production capacity and certainly the urgency of the threat means we really can't wait. Right? This, in addition, it's emboldening to opponents like the Houthis when we air our dirty laundry, when debates over such things are very public, or when you have parts of Congress who issue language that would restrict these kinds of support mechanisms. It shows the enemy that they can either wait out the political decision or that they should keep on their own military pressure because Israel or any other target they have will be abandoned quickly. So it actually encourages them. It helps them fundraise. It helps them recruit. These conversations, if we need to have them with partners like Israel, should happen quietly and should not be used to embolden opposition. So I think even as much as a political statement, as much as a military statement, this kind of support needs to continue so that opponents around the world don't say we are a hair's breadth away from the U.S. abandoning one of its oldest and strongest partners and allies. And if we keep this up, we will win. We do not want them to receive that message, and passing this kind of support sends the clear message that we stand with partners like Israel. It's quite basic, political warfare.
Kirsten Fontenrose, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your insights. We covered a lot of ground, but clearly the importance of understanding this threat from Yemen is critical in the coming months. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Israel is fighting a multi-front war. And as we've just discussed, the threat from the Houthis in Yemen is one of many threats that Israel must defend against. All of it comes back to Iran, not only threatening Israel, but also Americans and our interests. Each of us has a vital role to play. So please take action today by texting the word Israel to 24722 and urge Congress to stand with Israel. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.